Two young women vanish in the Appalachian Mountains, only to return 13 years later with disturbing symbols carved into their skin. This is not a tale of supernatural forces or mystical intervention. This is the documented account of what happens when bloodlines fold inward, when isolation becomes tradition, and when family ties become chains that bind generations to darkness. Deep in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, where fog clings to ancient trees and valleys hide secrets older than America itself, the small community of Hollowbrook existed in perpetual twilight. Spring of 1987 brought heavy rains that turned dirt roads into rivers of mud, isolating the already remote settlement even further from the outside world. The nearest town, Asheville, North Carolina, lay 43 miles away, accessible only by a winding mountain road that most locals avoided unless absolutely necessary. Hollowbrook consisted of approximately 67 residents, all connected through bloodlines that traced back to 3 original families who settled the area in the early 1800s. The Whitakers, the Morlands, and the Presswoods had intermarried for over a century and a half, creating a genetic tapestry so tightly woven that nearly every resident shared DNA with every other resident in ways that science would later describe as catastrophic. On the morning of April 14, 1987, 2 young women disappeared from Hollowbrook without a trace. Sarah Whitaker, 19 years old, and her cousin Rebecca Morland, 17, were last seen walking toward the old mining trail that led deeper into the mountains. Sarah, with her distinctive auburn hair and eyes that sat slightly too far apart on her face, a genetic marker common among the Whitakers, had told her mother Martha she was going to collect wild herbs. Rebecca, smaller in stature with a pronounced limp caused by a congenital hip deformity, accompanied her. When they failed to return by nightfall, the community organized a search party. 15 men and women, many showing visible signs of generations of intermarriage, combed the mountainside with oil lanterns and handmade torches. They called out the girls' names until their voices grew hoarse, but the mountains swallowed their cries, returning only silence. The local sheriff, William Presswood, a man whose own parents were first cousins, filed a missing persons report 3 days later. He noted in his official documentation that both young women were developmentally delayed, a euphemism for the cognitive impairments that plagued many Hollowbrook residents. Sarah functioned at roughly a 12-year-old level despite her age, while Rebecca struggled with basic reading and required assistance with complex tasks. The FBI sent 2 agents to investigate, but the mountain terrain and the community's deep-seated distrust of outsiders hampered their efforts. Residents refused to speak openly, their answers cryptic and guarded. The agents documented unusual family structures, noting that many households consisted of individuals related in multiple ways: uncle and nephew, cousin and brother, relationships that blurred traditional family boundaries. After 6 weeks of searching, the investigation went cold. The official conclusion suggested the young women had become lost in the vast wilderness and succumbed to the elements or wild animals. The case file was archived, and Hollowbrook returned to its isolated existence, mourning 2 more lives claimed by the unforgiving mountains. But the truth, as it would be revealed 13 years later, was far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel, because what you're about to discover in the next chapters will challenge everything you thought you knew about family, isolation, and the darkest consequences of keeping bloodlines pure. The truth behind Sarah and Rebecca's disappearance will leave you speechless. 13 years passed. The world outside moved forward, embraced technology, entered a new millennium. But in the deepest folds of the Appalachian Mountains, time moved differently. In the summer of 2000, a team of geological surveyors from the University of North Carolina stumbled upon something that shouldn't have existed. Deep in an unmapped valley, accessible only through a series of narrow ravines and overgrown paths, they discovered a settlement. not an abandoned relic from frontier days, but an active community of approximately 30 individuals living in conditions that resembled the 19th century more than the 21st. Dr. Marcus Chen, the lead geologist, would later describe the moment in his official report with palpable unease. His team had been mapping potential mineral deposits when they noticed smoke rising from beyond a ridge. Curiosity led them to investigate, and what they found defied rational explanation. The settlement consisted of 12 wooden structures, hand-built from local timber, arranged in a rough circle around a central clearing. No electricity, no running water, no modern conveniences of any kind. Residents wore homemade clothing, spoke in an archaic dialect of English mixed with phrases that seemed to belong to no known language, and displayed physical characteristics that immediately alarmed the educated observers. Nearly every individual they encountered showed signs of severe genetic disorders: facial asymmetries, shortened limbs, club feet, enlarged heads, eyes that didn't track properly, mouths that struggled to form words. Children played in the dirt with toys carved from wood, their laughter high-pitched and strange, their movements uncoordinated. But what truly horrified Dr. Chen and his team was the discovery of 2 young women locked inside a small cabin at the settlement's edge, who bore elaborate scarification patterns across their arms, necks, and faces. Symbols that resembled a grotesque mix of religious iconography and geometric patterns, carved deeply into flesh that had healed over years into raised, purple scars. When questioned, the women could barely speak coherent sentences. One had auburn hair, now streaked with premature grey. The other walked with a severe limp. It took several days of careful investigation before authorities confirmed their identities through dental records and old photographs. Sarah Whitaker and Rebecca Morland had been found. The settlement, it was discovered, had been established decades earlier by members of the original Hollowbrook families who had ventured even deeper into isolation, seeking to preserve what they called the purity of their bloodline. The founder, a man named Elijah Whitaker, Sarah's great-uncle and simultaneously her grandfather through a previous union between siblings, had died 5 years before the discovery, but his teachings lived on through his descendants. Interviews with settlement members revealed a disturbing social structure. Marriages occurred between the closest possible relatives, brothers and sisters, parents and children, with the explicit goal of keeping the family line uncontaminated by outsiders. Children born from these unions were considered blessed, regardless of their physical or mental disabilities. Those disabilities, in fact, were viewed as marks of divine favor, proof that the family was becoming something purer, more refined, more separated from the corrupted outside world. Sarah and Rebecca had not wandered into the settlement by accident. They had been captured during their herb-gathering expedition 13 years earlier, carried unconscious through hidden mountain passes to this forgotten valley. Their captors, distant relatives who occasionally traveled between Hollowbrook and the hidden settlement, had chosen them specifically for their youth and their existing family connections. In the settlement, the young women were forced into unions with multiple male relatives. The scarification symbols, investigators later learned, represented family lineage markers. Each symbol indicated a different bloodline connection, carved into flesh to create a permanent record of genetic heritage. Sarah bore 17 distinct symbols. Rebecca had 12. Medical examinations revealed the full horror of their 13-year captivity. Both women had given birth multiple times. DNA testing of the settlement's youngest children confirmed that Sarah was the biological mother of 4 children and Rebecca of 3. The fathers of these children were, in every case, closely related to the mothers, some brothers, some uncles, one case involving a relationship so genetically close that medical professionals struggled to classify it using standard terminology. The children themselves displayed severe congenital disorders. One could not walk or speak at age 7. Another had been born without fully formed arms. A third suffered from seizures so violent that they required constant supervision to prevent self-injury. Yet in the settlement's twisted logic, these children were precious, proof that the family line was becoming something beyond ordinary humanity. Authorities evacuated the entire settlement in August 2000. Social workers, medical professionals, and law enforcement descended upon the hidden valley, documenting everything, collecting evidence, preparing criminal cases against those responsible for kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and violations too numerous and disturbing to fully catalogue in official reports. Sarah and Rebecca were taken to a medical facility in Asheville, where doctors began the long, painful process of trying to help them reintegrate into a world they barely remembered. Their cognitive impairments, present even before their abduction, had worsened during their captivity. They struggled to communicate, flinched at loud noises, showed signs of profound trauma that went beyond psychological damage into something neurological and permanent. The outside world learned of the discovery through news reports that carefully sanitized the most disturbing details. Headlines spoke of a lost settlement found in the Appalachians, of survivors rescued after years in isolation. But the full truth, the genetic nightmares, the deliberate perpetuation of bloodline corruption, the children born into suffering, remained largely hidden from public view. The investigation into the hidden settlement opened doors that authorities wished had remained closed. What they discovered wasn't just one isolated community practicing extreme consanguinity, but a network of such settlements scattered throughout the most remote regions of Appalachia, each one a genetic time bomb waiting to detonate. Dr. Helena Strauss, a geneticist from Johns Hopkins University, was brought in to analyze the DNA samples collected from the settlement. Her findings, published in a restricted medical journal accessible only to researchers with specific clearances, painted a picture of genetic catastrophe. The level of inbreeding documented in the settlement exceeded anything previously recorded in modern populations. Coefficient of inbreeding values, the scientific measure of how genetically similar two parents are, reached levels typically seen only in laboratory experiments with isolated animal populations. In some cases, children had been produced from unions where the parents shared more than 50% of their DNA, far beyond the 25% shared by typical siblings. The consequences manifested in brutal clarity. Every single child born in the settlement over the past 15 years displayed some form of congenital disorder. Intellectual disabilities ranged from mild to profound. Physical deformities included skeletal malformations, organ abnormalities, immune system deficiencies, and neurological conditions that medical science struggled to fully categorize. Dr. Strauss interviewed Sarah and Rebecca extensively, though their limited communication abilities made the process agonizingly slow. Through patient questioning, assisted by therapists trained in working with trauma survivors, fragments of their story emerged. The settlement operated under a religious framework that twisted biblical concepts of chosen people and pure bloodlines into justification for genetic isolation. Elijah Whitaker, the founder, had preached that God intended families to remain separate from the corrupting influence of strangers. He taught that physical differences were gifts from the divine, that each generation born from close family unions brought the community closer to a state of sacred purity. Marriages in the settlement were arranged by a council of elders, all closely related to one another, who determined optimal pairings based on bloodline charts maintained in handwritten ledgers. These charts, recovered during the evacuation, revealed family trees that looked more like tangles of yarn, lines connecting and reconnecting in patterns that made professional genealogists physically ill to examine. Sarah, through halting words and with tears streaming down her scarred face, described the ceremony where she was marked with her first symbol. She had been in the settlement for 3 months, had fought constantly against her captors, had tried repeatedly to escape into the mountains. But the settlement was designed to prevent escape, surrounded by steep cliffs and dense forest, monitored constantly by guards who were simultaneously cousins, uncles, and brothers to nearly everyone else in the community. The marking ceremony involved the entire settlement. Elders chanted prayers in their corrupted dialect, while a woman used a knife heated in fire to carve the first symbol into Sarah's left arm. The symbol represented her connection to the Whitaker bloodline, a mark of ownership and heritage combined. As the blade cut into her flesh, she screamed until her voice gave out, but the community celebrated, viewing her pain as purification. If you believe families have the right to privacy, even when that privacy becomes a prison, comment below. Some secrets should stay buried. Let me know where you stand on this impossible question. Rebecca's account, delivered through a combination of broken words and drawings, revealed even more disturbing details. The settlement practiced what they called bloodline intensification, deliberately pairing the most closely related individuals to produce children they believed would carry concentrated family essence. Rebecca had been forced into a union with her own brother, who had been living in the settlement since childhood after being taken under similar circumstances years earlier. The medical team, working with the survivors, discovered that both women suffered from complex PTSD, malnutrition-related organ damage, and infections resulting from unsanitary living conditions and inadequate medical care during childbirth. Rebecca's hip deformity, already severe before her abduction, had worsened significantly without proper medical intervention. She now required a wheelchair for mobility beyond short distances. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of their rescue was their response to being separated from the children they had borne in captivity. Despite the horrific circumstances of those children's conception, despite the trauma and force involved, both Sarah and Rebecca grieved for the children taken into state custody. The human capacity for attachment, for maternal bonding, had persisted even in the most nightmarish conditions imaginable. The children themselves faced an uncertain future. Medical professionals debated whether it was even ethical to allow them to survive, given the severity of their conditions and the suffering they would endure. But such decisions were not theirs to make. The children were placed in specialized care facilities, where teams of doctors, therapists, and caretakers worked to provide them with whatever quality of life remained possible. Legal proceedings against the settlement's adult members moved slowly through the courts. Prosecutors struggled with how to charge individuals who had been raised from birth to believe their actions were not only acceptable, but divinely mandated. Defense attorneys argued diminished capacity, claiming their clients were themselves victims of generational indoctrination and genetic damage that impaired judgment. In the end, only 3 individuals received significant prison sentences. The rest were placed in supervised group homes or psychiatric facilities, judged incapable of standing trial due to cognitive impairments that made it impossible for them to understand the charges against them. The broader Hollowbrook community, the original settlement from which Sarah and Rebecca had been taken, faced its own reckoning. Genetic testing revealed that nearly every resident carried recessive genes for serious disorders, time bombs hidden in DNA that would manifest in future generations if the patterns of close intermarriage continued. Public health officials launched education campaigns, but changing behavior rooted in centuries of tradition proved nearly impossible. Families insisted they were doing nothing wrong, that their ways were their own business, that outsiders had no right to interfere. The constitutional questions around reproductive freedom, parental rights, and government intervention created legal tangles that persist to this day. The discovery of the hidden settlement was not an isolated incident, but the beginning of a broader revelation about genetic isolation in remote American communities. Over the following 3 years, authorities identified 6 additional settlements in Appalachia practicing similar extreme consanguinity. Some were even more remote than the first, accessible only by hiking for days through unmarked wilderness. Others hid in plain sight, appearing to outsiders as eccentric but harmless extended families living on large rural properties. Each settlement told a similar story. Initial isolation, driven by geography or choice, followed by generations of intermarriage that began innocently enough with cousins but intensified over time as the pool of potential partners shrank. Religious or philosophical justifications developed to explain and sanctify practices that outsiders would find abhorrent. And always, the children, bearing in their bodies and minds the consequences of genetic decisions made by their ancestors. Dr. Strauss expanded her research, building a database of genetic information from these communities. Her work revealed patterns that challenged comfortable assumptions about family, culture, and individual freedom. In one settlement discovered in eastern Kentucky, a community of 43 individuals descended entirely from a single couple who had settled in the area in 1862. That couple had 7 children who intermarried, producing grandchildren who also married amongst themselves. By the year 2000, when researchers gained access to the community, the average coefficient of inbreeding had reached catastrophic levels. Nearly 70% of children born in the previous 2 decades showed some form of disability. Deafness was particularly common, as was a specific form of dwarfism caused by a recessive gene that had proliferated through the limited gene pool. 3 children had been born with a rare neurological condition that caused progressive paralysis. 2 had already died, and the 3rd required constant care. Yet the community resisted intervention. They viewed their way of life as a fundamental right, argued that they harmed no one outside their own group, and insisted that their children were happy despite their challenges. They pointed out, not entirely incorrectly, that interfering with their reproductive choices set a dangerous precedent for government control over private family decisions. Sarah and Rebecca, meanwhile, struggled with their new reality. The modern world they had barely known before their abduction had changed dramatically during their 13-year absence. Technology they couldn't understand, social norms that made no sense, constant noise and stimulation that overwhelmed their damaged nervous systems. Sarah lived in a group home with other women who had experienced severe trauma. She spent her days in simple routines, meals, walks in a supervised garden, art therapy sessions where she drew pictures that disturbed her counselors with their dark imagery. She rarely spoke, and when she did, she sometimes used words from the settlement's corrupted dialect, phrases that made no sense in standard English. Rebecca's physical disabilities required more intensive care. She resided in a long-term medical facility where staff helped her with daily tasks she could no longer perform independently. She kept a photograph of her children, though visits were strictly supervised and infrequent. During one such visit, documented by a social worker, Rebecca held her youngest child, a boy with severe developmental delays and a cleft palate that had never been properly repaired before the settlement's discovery. The boy didn't recognize her. He pulled away, crying for the foster mother who had become his primary caregiver. Rebecca's anguished sobs could be heard throughout the facility. After that, she refused future visits, unable to bear the pain of being a stranger to children she had birthed in captivity. Public awareness of these hidden communities remained limited. Occasional news stories surfaced, quickly disappearing beneath more immediate concerns. America in the early 2000s faced terrorism threats, economic uncertainty, political division, problems that seemed more pressing than small groups of people living strangely in remote mountains. But for researchers and medical professionals working with survivors, the issue represented something profound and disturbing about human nature. What happens when cultural traditions, geographic isolation, and resistance to outside interference combine with the biological realities of genetic diversity? What obligations does society have to intervene when children suffer as a consequence of their parents' choices? Where do individual rights end and collective responsibility begin? These questions had no easy answers. Legal scholars debated them in academic journals. Ethicists struggled with competing principles of autonomy and protection. Meanwhile, in the mountains, in hidden valleys and remote hollows, the practices continued. Dr. Strauss's research identified risk factors that predicted where such communities might exist. Extreme geographic isolation combined with historical settlement by small founder populations, religious or cultural ideologies emphasizing separation from mainstream society, and documented instances of legal marriage between close relatives in public records all served as warning signs. Based on her analysis, she estimated that dozens of similar communities existed throughout rural America, places where bloodlines had folded inward for so many generations that genetic diversity had collapsed to dangerous levels. Most would never be discovered unless random chance brought them to official attention. They existed in America's forgotten spaces, invisible to a society that preferred not to acknowledge their existence. By 2013, 26 years after their initial disappearance and 13 years after their rescue, Sarah Whitaker and Rebecca Morland had become footnotes in specialized medical literature, case studies referenced in genetics textbooks and ethics courses. Sarah died on a cold February morning, her body discovered by a group home staff member during routine morning checks. She was 45 years old, but looked at least 60. Her body aged prematurely by years of malnutrition, stress, and the cascading health problems that often accompany severe genetic disorders, even in those who merely carry problematic genes without fully expressing them. The official cause of death was cardiac arrest, but her medical records told a story of comprehensive system failure. Her heart, her liver, her kidneys all showed damage consistent with chronic illness. The autopsy revealed something else, evidence of old fractures that had healed improperly, injuries sustained during her captivity that had never received proper medical attention. She was buried in a small cemetery in Asheville, her grave marked with a simple stone bearing her name and dates. 7 people attended the funeral, medical professionals and social workers who had worked with her over the years. No family members came. The Hollowbrook community had largely dissolved by then, younger members fleeing to cities and towns where they could disappear into anonymity, older members dying off, taking their secrets to graves scattered throughout the mountains. Rebecca survived another 4 years. She spent them in increasingly poor health, her body breaking down under the accumulated weight of genetic disadvantages, injuries, and the long-term effects of trauma. She rarely spoke, communicated mostly through gestures and expressions, lived in a world largely interior and inaccessible to those who cared for her. In her final months, she began drawing again, something she hadn't done in years. Her pictures depicted the hidden settlement, detailed renderings of buildings, faces, scenes from her captivity. Art therapists preserved these drawings, filed them away in case files that few would ever see. They showed a woman trying to make sense of an experience that defied rational comprehension, attempting to externalize memories too terrible to carry silently. She died in her sleep in July 2017, 30 years to the month after her abduction. She was 47 years old. Only 3 people attended her funeral, and like Sarah, no family members mourned her passing publicly. The children born in the settlement followed various paths. Some died young, their bodies unable to sustain life beyond infancy or early childhood despite intensive medical intervention. Others survived but required lifelong care, their disabilities too severe to ever allow independent living. A handful, those less severely affected by their genetic heritage, lived in supervised settings and learned basic self-care skills. None would ever fully escape the shadow of their conception. Their DNA carried the marks of extreme consanguinity, time bombs that might express themselves in future generations if they ever had children of their own. Most were sterilized, either through medical procedures or chemical interventions, decisions made by courts determining they lacked the capacity to consent to reproduction. The hidden settlement itself was destroyed. Authorities burned the buildings, erased the paths, let the forest reclaim the valley. Within 5 years, no visible trace remained of the community that had existed there. Nature proved remarkably efficient at erasing human presence when given the opportunity. But the genetic legacy persisted. Descendants of the original Hollowbrook families, scattered now across multiple states, carried recessive genes that might lie dormant for generations before expressing themselves. Genetic counselors recommended that anyone with known ancestry from the region undergo testing before having children, advice that went largely unheeded by those who viewed such testing as an invasion of privacy or an insult to family heritage. Dr. Strauss retired from active research in 2015, her decades of work documenting the consequences of extreme consanguinity having taken a psychological toll she finally acknowledged as unsustainable. Her final published paper, a comprehensive review of genetic isolation in American communities, concluded with a statement that was equal parts scientific observation and philosophical surrender. She wrote, "We have documented the biological consequences of extreme consanguinity with scientific precision. We understand the genetic mechanisms, can predict the outcomes, can intervene medically to mitigate some of the worst effects. What we cannot do is resolve the fundamental tension between individual liberty and collective welfare, between cultural autonomy and the rights of children who have no choice in the circumstances of their birth. This tension may be inherently irresolvable, a permanent feature of human society that we must acknowledge rather than pretend to solve." The story of Sarah Whitaker and Rebecca Morland represents more than individual tragedy. It reflects broader questions about family, identity, tradition, and the price of isolation. Their lives, marked from beginning to end by circumstances beyond their control, stand as testimony to what happens when bloodlines become prisons and family ties become chains. In the mountains of Appalachia, fog still clings to ancient trees, valleys still hide secrets. And in the most remote regions, places where roads don't reach and outside interference remains minimal, practices continue that most Americans would prefer not to acknowledge. The symbols carved into Sarah and Rebecca's flesh told a story of genetic heritage maintained at terrible cost. Those symbols are gone now, buried with the women who bore them. But the practices they represented, the ideology they embodied, the consequences they illustrated, these persist in shadows and silence. This is not a ghost story. This is not supernatural horror. This is documented reality, verified through DNA testing, medical records, legal proceedings, and the tragic testimony of survivors who bore witness to something that should not exist in modern America but does. 2 young women vanished in the Appalachian Mountains. They returned 13 years later with disturbing symbols carved into their skin. They spent the remainder of their lives carrying the weight of what those symbols represented. Genetic chains forged over generations, marking them as property, as vessels, as links in a bloodline that had turned back on itself until it could no longer sustain life without suffering.